I'm Claire, and welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Tonight's story takes place inside the Royal Navy, a world apart, its own rhythms, its own language, its own loyalties, and for the young men and women who serve, it offers adventure, purpose, a family, a brotherhood, a chance to see the world. For some of them, it became something far darker. Today we're looking at a series of murders that went undetected for years inside that world, and the painstaking investigation that would eventually, partially, bring one man to justice. Partially because some questions remain unanswered even to this day. Portsmouth sits on the southern tip of England, on the edge of the Solent, a stretch of water that separates the mainland from the Isle of Wight. It is, in the most literal sense, a city built around sea. The Royal Navy has been there since the 15th century. The docks that line its harbour are among the oldest and most storied in the world. HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, still sits in dry dock there. 1.5 miles of warships and history visible from the city centre on a clear day. It is also, by any measure, a big city, a population of about 250,000 packed onto Portsea Island. Technically, it's an island, separated from the mainland of the UK by Portland Creek. It's so narrow and built over that you wouldn't even know. It feels like the mainland. It's one of the most densely populated places in the UK outside London. And it has a feel of a place always in motion. Ships coming in, ships going out, sailors on shore leave, students from the university spilling into the same bars and clubs, dock workers, families, and people passing through. Portsmouth is not a quiet place. It's never been a quiet place. In the 1990s, it was particularly alive. Southsea, the seafront suburb that bleeds into the city's southern edge, had a nightlife that drew people from across Hampshire, clubs and pubs running into the early hours of the morning, packed with Navy personnel, students, and young people from the surrounding towns who'd come in for the weekend. It was vibrant and loud and transient in a way that port cities always are, full of people who were only there for a while, and they knew it. Simon Parkes was born in Kingswood on the east edge of Bristol in 1968. He was a happy and energetic boy, described by those who knew him as someone who lit up the room. From the age of 12, he'd wanted just one thing: to join the Royal Navy. Not a passing fancy, a fixed, certain ambition that never wavered. He joined the Sea Cadets at 12, the natural starting point for a boy with Navy in his blood. He learned the basics and he learned the rhythms of it. As soon as he was old enough, he signed up. His family had mixed feelings. He was so young, but they knew their son. They knew this wasn't an impulse, but a vocation, and they respected it. He would be safe, they told themselves. He was among people who looked after their own. He trained as a radio operator and was posted to the HMS Illustrious, a light aircraft carrier, one of the most celebrated ships in the fleet. Illustrious had been commissioned in 1982 and had served with distinction in the Falkland War a short time before Simon came on board. For a teenager from Bristol who was dreaming of the Navy since primary school, it was more than he could have hoped for. He was exactly where he wanted to be. HMS Illustrious, lusty to everyone who served on her, was a world unto herself. 210 metres long, displacing 22,000 tonnes. And she carried over 1,000 men. A ship's company of around 685, plus Fleet Air armed crews who operated the aircraft. Sea Harrier jump jets for their defence and attack. Sea King helicopters in the anti-submarine and airborne early warning roles. She was powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus gas turbines, the same engines as Concorde, and she was fast. Over 28 knots, and that is 32 miles an hour or 52 kilometres an hour. For a boy from Kingswood who'd grown up dreaming of this, stepping aboard for the first time would have been overwhelming in the best possible way. Life on board was governed by the watch system. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, around the clock, every day that she was at sea. The ship never slept. Someone was always at their post, always listening, always monitoring. For Simon, as a radio operator, that meant hours in the communication centre, headphones on, the world outside reduced to signal and static. Then back to the mess deck. 15 men to a space that felt tight at first and familiar within a couple of weeks. Each bunk had its own light, its own blackout curtain, a small privacy in a world with very little of it. There was a mess square where off-watch men could watch television, play cards, or sit and write some letters home. A beer ration, 2 cans a day, the Royal Navy being a wet ship, unlike its American counterparts. The NAFI sold small luxuries like biscuits and toiletries and things from home. And the food was known as scran. 3 meals a day, served to the clock. Fish and chips on Friday and a roast on Sunday, even at sea. And above their heads, when flight operations were running, the noise of the Harrier launching from the ski jump at its bow was something that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. The engineering spaces deep in the hull ran at punishing heat. The ship was never quiet or still. The only connection to home for months at a stretch were letters. Mail went out and came in when they were in port, sometimes weeks between exchanges. You wrote and you waited. In 1986, Illustrious was preparing for something extraordinary. Global 86, a 9-month world deployment. The plan for the ship and her task group to sail west, across the Atlantic, making stops along the American East Coast, then pushing through to Australia, across to Southeast Asia, India, Singapore, and then home via Gibraltar. 9 months, multiple continents, every port a run ashore, every landfall a story to put in your next letter home. The departure from Portsmouth was exactly what you would imagine. The kind of send-off that stays with you. The quayside packed with families, streamers, the ship's company lining the flight deck as Illustrious moved out through the Solent. For the young sailors on board, many away from home for the first time in their lives, it was the moment that they had signed up for. And then 2 days out of Portsmouth, disaster. On the 3rd of April, 1986, just after midnight, Illustrious suffered a catastrophic gearbox explosion. The starboard inner gearbox had been overhauled during the maintenance period beforehand, but as it heated up to full speed, oil vapour ignited. The explosion sent fire roaring through the forward gearbox room and up through the ship's vertical trunking. It burned for over 4 hours. Sea Harriers were scrambled off the flight deck while the fire raged below. One Sea King airlifted the single casualty, smoke inhalation, to shore. The destroyer HMS Nottingham and the ferry Sea Leopard stood by in case the worst didn't happen. The crew fought the fire and held it. Illustrious limped back to Portsmouth under her own power, running on the aft engine room alone. For the crew, it was a brutal deflection. The great departure, the families on the quayside, the streamers, the Solent falling away behind them, undone in one night. The deployment was postponed for 3 months while the damage was repaired. Some men were even reassigned, and the world waited. Then came the sprint. When the repairs were complete, Illustrious didn't follow the original route. She sailed directly east at high speed, 8,882 miles from Portsmouth to Singapore, to rejoin the task group for the second half of the deployment. The western legs, the American East Coast ports were gone, but what remained was substantial. Singapore, Australia, the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia. The highlight of the Australian leg was the Royal Australian Navy's 75th Anniversary Fleet Review in Sydney. Ships from across the world assembled in Sydney Harbour for the crew of Illustrious, already months at sea, already carrying the weight of the fire, delayed departure, and the long sea sprint east. It would have been something to remember for the rest of their lives. Simon was 18 years old, seeing the world, buying Christmas presents along the way to carry home to his family at the end of it all. By December, it was nearly over. The ship was heading home. Portsmouth, Christmas, family. The last stop before it all was Gibraltar, a brief shore leave on the Rock before the final leg home. Gibraltar, 2 miles wide, 4 miles long, a limestone ridge rising dramatically from the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. British sovereign territory since 1713. The Rock, as everyone calls it, a place of narrow streets, duty-free shops, British pubs with Spanish sunshine outside. For sailors, it was a homeward run. It was a familiar and beloved last stop and a place to breathe and to celebrate, to shake off the last 9 months at sea before the final push north. Simon called his mother Margaret when Illustrious docked. He wanted to make sure she'd got the right passes to come down to the dock and meet him when they came in. He was excited, and he was days from home. On the morning of the 12th of December, Illustrious came in to dock at 9 o'clock in the morning. Simon went ashore around midday. About 30 men went ashore with him, and the rest stayed on board on duty. The day unfolded the way those days do. A relaxed wander through the main street, a few drinks, the particular pleasure of solid ground after months at sea. He had a drink at the Angry Friar and then the Horseshoe pub on Main Street, and he wandered down to the Venture Inn in the afternoon, chatted to some girls, had a game of pool at the Royal Oak, and then back to the Horseshoe. By some accounts, radio DJ Simon Bates was there that evening. It was that kind of night, loose, cheerful, and the end of something long, and the beginning of something anticipated. At around 10:30, Simon told his friends at the Horseshoe that he was heading out to eat and then back to the ship. He turned left out of the pub towards Illustrious. A witness later reported seeing someone matching his description, slightly drunk, on his own, near the Fleet Pavilion at the Hole in the Wall pub, where a naval function was being held. That was the last confirmed sighting anyone has ever had of Simon Parkes. He was wearing faded blue jeans, a pale grey t-shirt, and a blue and grey diamond pattern jumper. He had a tattoo on his right arm, a black horse's head, with his name Simon through it. He didn't get back on board that night, and his crewmates assumed he'd had too much to drink and found somewhere to sleep it off. It happened. They'd see him in the morning, but morning came and Simon didn't. They did search for him, but it wasn't the first time this kind of thing had happened, and the ship had to stick to its plan. On the 14th of December, HMS Illustrious sailed for Portsmouth. Simon's passport was still in the cabin, his clothes, his Christmas presents for his family, bought on the road, carried across the world, waiting to be given. Everything he owned was on that ship, except Simon. When Illustrious docked at Portsmouth, Margaret Parks was on the quayside. Around her, the families of other sailors, wives, parents, brothers and sisters, pressing forward as the men came off the ship. The relief and the noise and the reunions happening all around her. She had her passes, just as she and Simon had arranged on the phone from Gibraltar, and she was ready. But her son was not among the men who came off the ship. The Navy's initial response was, in essence, a shrug. The working assumption was one communicated to his family. He was AWOL, absent without leave. The Navy's initial response was, in essence, a shrug. The working assumption, the one communicated to his family, was AWOL, absent without leave. Sailors went ashore and didn't come back sometimes. They'd wait and see. But Margaret and David knew their son. He had phoned from Gibraltar to sort out the dockside passes. He'd left every single possession on board. He'd been counting down to his homecoming for months. He'd got Christmas presents waiting in his cabin. This was not a young man who had chosen to disappear. A 250-man search was mounted in Gibraltar in the immediate aftermath. They searched bars, alleys, the harbour, the streets, where he'd last been seen, but nothing. No body, no trace, no answers. And then silence. For years, Simon Parks remained officially classified as not dead, not murdered, but missing, as AWOL. The family received no family liaison support, no serious investigative update, no acknowledgement that anything other than a voluntary disappearance might have occurred. Margaret has spoken about those years with a quiet devastation that stays with you. The raw grief of the early days, she says, eventually changes shape. It doesn't leave. It becomes the thing underneath everything else, a question that never stops. Where is Simon? He would have turned 20 in 1988, 25 as the 90s began, 30 as the millennium turned. His parents aged around the question, and the world moved on, and Simon stayed 18 years old in a diamond pattern jumper somewhere on the Rock of Gibraltar on a December evening, turning left towards the ship. Portsmouth, December 1997. 11 years later, Nicholas Wright was 18 years old from Leicester. He'd grown up wanting to be in the Navy, a lifelong ambition by his family's account, and much like Simon had been the decade before. He had joined the HMS Edinburgh, a destroyer based at Portsmouth. HMS Edinburgh was a Type 42 destroyer, a guided missile ship built for air defiance. Her primary weapon, a Sea Dart missile system mounted on her forward deck. Where Illustrious was a city at sea, Edinburgh was lean and purposeful. 130 metres long, a crew of around 270, fast, manoeuvrable, designed to protect a fleet from an airborne attack, known to those who served on her as the fortress of the sea. Nicholas had been on board for 1 week. On the evening of the 12th of December, Nicholas was on shore leave in Portsmouth. He ended up at Joanna's nightclub on the South Parade in Southsea, a legendary venue full of naval personnel that weekend. Nicholas was sociable. He'd been talking to a lot of people that night. Witnesses recalled seeing him on the back stairs, chatting to an older man that he seemed to know. An instructor from a firefighting course that he'd done on the HMS Excellent the month before. He was described as friendly and helpful. Someone the younger sailors knew and trusted. His name was Alan Grimson. Nicholas didn't come home that night. The next morning, he didn't appear. He'd arranged to meet his grandfather at Unicorn Gate on Saturday morning. Unicorn Gate is one of the main entrances to HMND Portsmouth, the naval base. It's a historic gate and it's been there since the 18th century. The name comes from the unicorn on the royal coat of arms. They'd arranged to meet, but Nicholas didn't come. His family raised the alarm immediately. They refused to accept the AWOL classification and reported it to the police, who opened a missing persons investigation. Officers went back to Joanna's. They spoke to everyone that had been there that night. Friends, bar staff, witnesses, multiple people remember seeing Nicholas on the back stairs with Alan Grimson, the firefighting instructor. And police brought Grimson in. He was cooperative, articulate, and happy to talk. He confirmed that they'd spoken briefly on the stairs the night before. Just a friendly chat, he said. Nicholas, he said, seemed fairly drunk. And then Grimson headed home, leaving Nicholas there, and that was all he knew. Sadly, the trail went cold. No matter how hard police worked the case, they couldn't move forward with it. No witnesses placing Nicholas anywhere after Joanna's. No CCTV that helped. No body, no answers. The case eventually went quiet. 18 months passed. Detective Inspector Neil Cunningham of the Hampshire Police was assigned to the Nicholas Wright case and started at the beginning, going back over every statement, re-interviewing all the witnesses and looking for anything that might have been missed. He would later say that he was constantly inspired by the family, by the need to find answers for them, whether those were good or bad. Working methodically through everything, Cunningham kept returning to one statement. Alan Grimson, the last known person to have seen Nicholas alive, the man on the back stairs. Police believed there was more to the story than Grimson had told them. They decided to bring him back in. Now, Grimson was brought in alongside a good friend of his that was also there that night, who was also questioned and whose home was also searched. The friend's reaction was exactly what you'd expect from an innocent man. Confusion, agitation, pushing back. Why? What's this all about? What's going on? Grimson's reaction was entirely different. He was calm and composed, eloquent even, and he was really happy to talk at length about his Navy career, his background and his service record. The officers let him talk, no rush, just building a picture. There was no confusion from Grimson and no outrage, no bewilderment at being brought in for questioning about a young man's disappearance. An innocent man, one would think, might consider why on earth the police believed he had any involvement. Grimson didn't wonder. He simply answered the questions and waited. That was day one. Both men spent the night in the cells. A night in custody is a long time to think. Police hoped the morning might bring something new, a loosened memory, a detail someone wanted to get off their chest. First thing, the following morning, Grimson told the custody sergeant that he had a message for the detectives. He wanted to tell them about the disappearance of Nicholas Wright. 18 months, hours of grainy CCTV footage, statements read and read again, witnesses interviewed and then interviewed again, frustration and dead ends, and the quiet, grinding work of an investigation going nowhere. And then they pull the only real thread, the last person to see him. And the whole thing comes apart in a morning. Alan Michael Grimson had been born in 1958 in a quiet market town on the Suffolk border. He was the third of 4 children, son of a soldier. In 1978, at 19, he joined the Royal Navy. He'd started as a galley chef. He was not a man who drew admiration on sight. He was large, well over 6 foot, physically imposing in a way that filled the room, with a broad, heavy-featured face that his colleagues, with the blunt humour of men living at close quarters for months at a stretch, had mocked without ceremony for years. They called him Frank, short for Frankenstein. It wasn't affectionate. Grimson absorbed it, apparently without reaction. The way he seemed to absorb most things, quietly, his interior life entirely sealed off from those around him. Over 22 years, he had worked his way to petty officer. He had served on some of the most storied ships in the fleet: Invincible, Ark Royal, and Illustrious. He'd travelled the world, and in his later career, he'd moved into firefighting and firefighting instruction. Eventually posted to HMS Excellent in Portsmouth, the naval school through which every young rating passed for fire training, a position of authority, of trust. Every new recruit who came through those courses answered to him. To those who had served alongside him, Grimson was, in the words that came up again and again, reliable, professional, friendly, the kind of man you wanted beside you, a big lad, colleagues said, and some of the younger sailors tended to be a bit wary of him at first, but helpful, they said, always willing to offer a lift or to pass on a phone number to look out for those new recruits. However, he was described as a bit of a loner, and you never saw him with a woman, but nobody thought much of it. He drank at Ruby's, the Royal Standard on Edinburgh Road. He followed Man United, and he travelled at weekends to away fixtures. Nothing about any of it on the surface was remarkable. And here, investigators ran into something that was not just a feature of this particular case, but a structural fact of the world Grimson had inhabited for over 2 decades. Homosexuality in the British Armed Forces during Grimson's years of service was not just discouraged. It was actually a criminal offence under military law, grounds for court-martial, dismissal, and potential prosecution. The consequences for a gay serviceman who was discovered extended far beyond the loss of a job. It meant the loss of a career, a pension, a community, a sense of self. The message the institution sent to gay men within its ranks was categorical. You do not exist here. The ban wouldn't actually be lifted until the 1st of January 2000, just weeks away, as the Hampshire police were now working through their files. Cunningham and Fitzjohn sat down across from Grimson and pressed record. Grimson told them that he first noticed Nicholas Wright on the firefighting course at HMS Excellent in November in 1997. Nicholas was new, barely weeks into the posting, young and eager in a way that new ratings were. After the course, Grimson had given him his phone number, told him that he ever needed a lift home to Leicester at the weekends. He often travelled that way. Something, he said, he did for various lads. They'd stayed in contact, and on the evening of the 12th of December, 1997, they'd actually ran into each other at Joanna's, exactly as he'd stated before, and exactly as the witnesses had previously stated. What he hadn't told them was what happened next. They left together. They went back to Grimson's flat on the London road. Grimson made a pass at Nicholas, and Nicholas had pushed him away. The rejection, Grimson would later explain, triggered something. All those years of suppression and silence and being someone he wasn't allowed to be. The rage of it came up, and he beat Nicholas with his fists and then with a baseball bat. As Nicholas went down, Grimson took a diver's knife A really sharp diver's knife, he said, and he cut his throat. He demonstrated the motion to Cunningham as he described it, showed them with his hands exactly what he'd done. He then stated that he carried Nicholas to the bath, and then he went to bed. The following day, Grimson stayed at the flat. He spent the whole day there, he said, with Nicholas in the bath. He was, he told detectives, deciding what to do. Under the cover of darkness on the 13th of December, he wrapped Nicholas's body and carried it to the car, a blue Vauxhall Astra, and loaded it into the boot. He drove out of the car park onto the street, and as he pulled out, he saw a police officer. Grimson actually stopped, wound the window down, and he spoke briefly to the officer, just an ordinary everyday exchange. The whole time, Grimson told Cunningham, he was thinking one thing. I bet you can't guess what's in the boot of my car. It was at this point, detectives said, that they understood that they weren't dealing with a panic. Not a man who had done something terrible in a moment of rage and spent the day since paralysed with fear. The man sitting across from them had stopped the car to chat with a police officer with a body in the boot of his car, and he found it thrilling. This was something else entirely. He even agreed to show the police where the body was. Calmly, they drove north out of Portsmouth and into the Hampshire countryside. Eventually, he even agreed to show the police where the body was. Calmly, they drove north out of Portsmouth and into the Hampshire countryside and onto a country commuter road that thousands of commuters would pass daily heading to Winchester or back home in the evening. Grimson indicated to stop at a lay-by marked only by an odd-shaped oak tree. There they pulled over and got out. Grimson pointed at a verge and walked back towards the car. Cunningham asked him, "What are you pointing at?" "That's where I left the body," he told Cunningham coldly. And yeah, hidden in the tall grass and shrubbery, that's where they found Nicholas. He went missing on the 12th of December, 1997. His body was recovered on the 16th of December, 1999. 2 years on the side of a Hampshire field. Nicholas Wright was formally identified by his dental records on the 16th of December. The post-mortem examination established that he died from head injuries consistent with what Grimson had described. 2 years of exposure had taken almost everything else. The state of the remains post-mortem could only confirm the cause of death, but little more. He was 18 years old. In Grimson's last interview with the police, moments before they formally charged him for the murder of Nicholas Wright, Cunningham asked Grimson one more question. A hunch that had been nagging in the back of his mind the whole time. He asked, "Is there anything else you wish to discuss with us?" And Grimson answered simply, "There was one more." "One more what?" Grimson asked. "One more body." Sean Jenkins was 20 years old from Newbury in Berkshire. He'd also done a stint at the Royal Navy too. Some sources say it was as short as 5 weeks. It was during that time that he'd crossed paths with Grimson, and it hadn't worked out for him at the Royal Navy, and he'd ended up working in Portsmouth as a barman at the Hogshead pub on Palmerston Road on Southsea, young and getting on with life in a city that was full of people doing the exact same thing. At some point in December 1998, a year after Nicholas had vanished, Sean stopped showing up for work. No one reported him missing. He was 20 years old, living away from home in a transient city full of people coming and going. No alarm was raised. No missing person report filed. Sean Jenkins simply wasn't there one day, and Portsmouth carried on without noticing. Grimson told detectives what had happened. He'd run into Sean that December and recognised him from their time in the Navy together. He was drunk. Very drunk, Grimson said, and he'd taken him back to his flat on London Road. He had thought, he said, about how it had felt the first time, that feeling. He wanted it again, the power and control. He held Sean at knife point through the night. He sexually assaulted him. In the morning, when Sean said he wanted to leave, Grimson bound him to the bath, put a towel over his head. He thought about the mess from the last time, he said, and he beat him with a baseball bat. Sean Jenkins was 20 years old. Grimson said that it wasn't as thrilling as the first time. Nicholas had fought. Sean had been more submissive. The power wasn't the same. He left Sean's body by a road a few miles from where he'd left Nicholas's. Both of them on roadsides that people drove past every day. Both of them on the 12th of December. 12 months apart. What is it about that date? No one has ever said. No answer has ever been given, and it's still one of the questions that remain today. When the interviewers paused, Grimson told the detectives he'd take them there. Sean's body was found on the A32 at West Tisted, just 4 miles from Nicholas's body. Sean was formally identified by a palm print, and the autopsy results revealed exactly what they suspected. He'd also died of blunt force trauma to the head. So now there were 2. In Grimson's long service history, and again, actually there were suspicions of, were there possibly more? The investigation team now began the work of going back through everything. Grimson's full service record in his postings, every ship he'd served on, every course he's instructed, every port he'd passed through in the last 22 years, cross-referencing dates, matching his naval postings against unexplained disappearances, missing persons records, men who had simply stopped being there. One naval officer, working alongside the investigation team, was going through a list of missing and AWOL Navy personnel, and a date jumped out at him. December the 12th. 1986. There was a name on the list, a young rating gone missing from a ship on shore leave in Gibraltar, and he had disappeared on the 12th of December, and his name was Simon Parks. Alison Grimson had served 2 tours on the HMS Illustrious, one of them in 1986. Simon Parks, 18 years old, from Kingswood in Bristol, the boy who wanted to be in the Navy since he was 12 years old, who had joined the Sea Cadets the moment he was old enough, and who had signed up to the Royal Navy the moment he was old enough, who had called his mom from Gibraltar to make sure she had the right passes, who had Christmas presents in his cabin waiting to come home, who had turned left out of the Horseshoe pub on the 12th of December 1986 towards the Illustrious, and had never been seen again. 15 years his family had waited. 15 years of being told in effect that their son had chosen to disappear. And now, suddenly, there was a name, a connection. A man who had been on that ship, in that port, on that night. A man who had just confessed to killing 2 sailors, both on the 12th of December, both after luring them somewhere. They trusted him. Did Simon's family finally have an answer? Horrifying, heartbreaking, but an answer? No, it didn't happen. All of the connections between Grimson and Simon were circumstantial, not enough to prosecute and not enough to charge. Grimson, when interviewed about Simon Parks, denied everything. He had known him, he said. He'd been ashore that night in Gibraltar, but he had nothing to do with his disappearance. And he has maintained that position ever since. He confessed to 2 murders. He's never admitted to the 3rd. Why confess to 2 and not 3? Only Grimson knows, because Simon's body has never been found. No body, no forensic evidence, nothing to contradict his denial. Perhaps because he still hoped one day to be released, and a third murder charge changes that entirely. Perhaps damage limitation. His mother was still alive at the time, and perhaps something else entirely. But whatever it is, only he knows. What his family does know is this: their boy is not coming home, and the man who most certainly knows where he is has chosen, for nearly 40 years, to say nothing. On the 26th of March 2001, Alan Grimson stood at Winchester Crown Court and pleaded guilty to the murders of Nicholas Wright and Sean Jenkins. There was no jury, no contested trial. He'd confessed. One psychologist, having assessed him alongside more than 250 other murderers, described Grimson as the worst psychopath he'd ever encountered. Justice Creswell sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Before he did, he addressed Grimson directly. "You are a serial killer in nature, if not in number. You are a highly dangerous serial killer who has killed 2 young men in horrifying and appalling circumstances." He recommended that Grimson never be released. One of the last things Grimson had said to police during those early confession interviews was this: if he hadn't been arrested when he was, there would certainly have been another one. The Home Secretary increased the term to 25 years. Grimson appealed. In 2008, the High Court reduced it back to 22. He was sent to HMP Frankland in County Durham. Monster Mansion, as it's known throughout the prison system, a Category A maximum security prison. Ian Huntley was there. Levi Belfield is there. Wayne Couzens also. It's not the kind of place where you get sent for rehabilitation. It's a place people are sent because they cannot safely be anywhere else. In 2004, it was reported that Grimson had been given a role as a listener, a prisoner trained by the Samaritans to provide emotional support to fellow inmates in crisis. He was accused of sexually assaulting a vulnerable prisoner he had been assigned to help. No charges were ever publicly confirmed. And then in 2019, he was moved to HMP Hollesley Bay in Suffolk, a Category D open prison, a lowest security category in the British system, where prisoners work in the community and they prepare for release. He was set for parole in November 2019. The judge who sentenced him had recommended that he never be released, but he was preparing to apply for parole regardless. Margaret Parks heard about it and she said that's the worst thing she could possibly think, that he's walking around free, not because of his crimes and punishment, but because she believes he's a very dangerous man. "I don't think psychologically he can change." Margaret Parks heard about it. She said that's the worst possible thing, that he could be walking around free, not because of his crimes and his punishment, because she believed him to be a very dangerous man. "I don't think psychologically he can change, even after all these years. He is very clever and he can use any situation." The parole board refused his release on public safety grounds in October 2022. Thank God. Now, in February 2025, Hampshire Police served Grimson with a postal requisition. 13 historical sex offences, 4 alleged victims, 3 men and a boy aged 14. Officers allege these have taken place between 1994 and 1999, not in prison, during his active naval career, while he was still running firefighting courses at HMS Excellent, while Nicholas Wright was still alive. Now, while Grimson had sat in prison all these years, the world had changed around him. On the 12th of January 2000, the Royal Navy had lifted its ban on gay personnel serving openly, forced to do so by a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which found that dismissing service members on the grounds of sexuality violated their right to privacy. Homosexuality had been decriminalised in civilian life since 1967, but the armed forces had been explicitly exempt. It remained a criminal offence under military law until January of 2000. Between 1989 and 1998 alone, over 500 service members had been discharged from the military service purely for their sexuality. However, Britain actually wasn't leading the way. The Netherlands had lifted its military ban in 1974, the first country in the world to do so. Canada and Australia followed in 1992, and Israel in 1993, South Africa in 1998. The US operated under a don't ask, don't tell from 1993. Gay personnel were permitted to serve, but only in silence. It was fully repealed in 2011, making America one of the last Western militaries to act, 11 years behind the United Kingdom. For the men who had encountered Grimson during his career, who had said nothing, because to speak would be to invite the same scrutiny turned on themselves, the change in the law meant that for the first time, they could come forward without fear of reprisal, without risk to their careers, their livelihood and their reputation. The 13 charges served on Grimson in February 2025 represented 4 victims, 4 men who waited, in some cases, for 30 years to be able to tell what happened to them. He appeared at Basingstoke Magistrates' Courts and pleaded not guilty to all 13 charges. A trial date was set for June 2026. He's back behind closed doors, on remand, awaiting that trial. And he is 66 years old. Hampshire Police launched Operation Thornhill, and they went back into the records of Global 86. They established that Grimsett had been ashore on the night of the 12th of December 1986 in Gibraltar. They found witnesses who placed him and Simon in the same places that evening. But it was not enough. In May 2000, the Sunday Mirror reported that Grimson had privately admitted to killing Simon and had drawn rough maps, areas where police should search. He wouldn't give a specific location, and police believed he was playing games. Margaret issued a statement. In December 1986, our world stopped. Not knowing what happened to Simon has haunted us for 16 years. We know he isn't alive, but we cannot begin to grieve. I need to know where Simon is. I want him to be found so we can bring him home and give him a proper burial. In January 2003, Hampshire Police flew to Gibraltar with cadaver dogs, ground teams, and they searched the grounds around the South Barracks, Rosier Lane, and the Trafalgar Cemetery, the old British military burial ground on the southern tip of the rock, looking out over the bay where Illustrious had once been moored, and they found nothing. In 2019, the Hampshire Police received what they described as new and credible intelligence. A specialist team returned again to Gibraltar. They found nothing. In August 2023, they went back to the Town Range car park. In January 2024, they returned again. The same year, Margaret and David flew to Gibraltar, not for a search this time, but for a tree planting. A small ceremony, a place to stand and say his name. Margaret was 79 years old at the time. On the 30th of December 2025, Hampshire Police announced that the investigation into the disappearance of Simon Parkes was now being held on file. Not closed, they were careful about that distinction. Detective Superintendent Adam Edwards said that if new information came in, they would act on it. He asked again for anyone who had been in Gibraltar that night to come forward. So Margaret said that they'd made the right decision. There was no other decision they could make. As a family, they're going through a life sentence not knowing what happened to Simon or where he was buried. It's only right, at least, until he gives up the information, that he suffers the same. Margaret Parks, in her late 70s, and she thinks of Simon every day. She said that she doesn't think about Alan Grimson at all. We remember 3 young men, Simon, Nicholas and Sean. Thank you for walking this path with me today.